This is the unknown zone, where the world's most powerful secrets are revealed and history's hidden stories are brought back to life. In the summer of 1944, one of the greatest lies ever told decided the fate of the world. It was a deception so vast it fooled an entire army, even Adolf Hitler himself. While the Allies prepared to invade France, another army was created from thin air, a phantom force of fake tanks, fake soldiers, and fake radio signals. This wasn't science fiction, it was real, and it worked. This is the untold story of Operation Fortitude, the secret that made D-Day possible. In the early months of 1944, Europe stood on the edge of liberation. After nearly 5 years of war, the Allies had pushed the Axis forces back across North Africa and Italy, and now the final objective was clear. The liberation of Western Europe would begin with a single massive strike, an invasion across the English Channel. But the Germans were ready. Their fortifications stretched along the coast from Norway to the Bay of Biscay, a massive defense system they called the Atlantic Wall. Every German commander knew that one day the Allies would come. What they didn't know was where. The success of the invasion would depend not only on soldiers, tanks, and ships, but on something far more subtle: deception. If the Germans could be made to believe the invasion would land somewhere else, the real attack might succeed. This became one of the greatest strategic deceptions in the history of warfare, a plan so elaborate that it fooled Hitler himself. It was called Operation Fortitude. The seeds of fortitude were planted in London months before the invasion. The British had already proven masters of deception. Earlier in the war, they had tricked the Germans during campaigns in North Africa, using fake units and misleading radio messages. But now, the stakes were far greater. If the D-Day invasion failed, the war in Europe could be lost. Every soldier landing on those beaches would depend on the Germans believing a lie. At the heart of this deception stood the 20 Committee, a small, secret group of British intelligence officers whose name came from the Roman numerals XX, meaning double cross. Their job was to turn captured German spies into double agents and feed false information back to their commanders. These agents became the backbone of Fortitude. They would deliver carefully constructed lies to the German High Command, reinforcing the illusion that the real invasion was not at Normandy, but somewhere else entirely. The deception was divided into two parts: Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North aimed to convince the Germans that an Allied force was preparing to invade Norway. It used fake radio traffic, phantom units, and even a made-up army group. The goal was to keep German troops tied down in Scandinavia, far from the main battlefield. But the more important of the two was Fortitude South, the deception that would shape D-Day itself. Fortitude South's goal was to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would take place not in Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. It was the most logical location for an invasion, the shortest crossing, the closest to German territory, and the most direct route to the heart of France. The Germans already expected it. Fortitude's job was to make sure they believed it so completely that they would keep their troops there even after Normandy had begun. To sell the illusion, the Allies created an entirely fictional army, the first US Army Group, or FUSAG. It was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, one of the most feared and respected Allied officers. To the Germans, Patton was the obvious choice to lead the invasion. His reputation for aggression and speed made him the perfect bait. But in reality, Patton was being used as the centerpiece of the deception. The army he commanded didn't exist. Across southeastern England, from Dover to Kent, fake camps were constructed. Rows of inflatable tanks sat under camouflage nets. Wooden aircraft were parked on makeshift runways. Dummy landing craft floated in harbors, made of canvas and plywood. At night, headlights moved along roads to mimic convoys. The deception was total. Even Allied pilots flying overhead were not told what was real and what was fake. From the air, it looked like an army preparing to invade France. And that was exactly what German reconnaissance planes reported back to Berlin. Meanwhile, the double agents began feeding the story directly into the German intelligence network. Chief among them was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish agent known by his code name, Garbo. He was one of the most successful double agents in history. To the Germans, he was a trusted source who had built an entire network of fictional sub-agents across Britain. In truth, every piece of information he sent was crafted by British intelligence. Through Garbo, Fortitude South reached deep into the enemy's command. His reports described detailed troop movements, fake divisions, and supposed delays in the Allied invasion due to weather. He sent maps, fake radio messages, and even intercepted intelligence planted by the British. Every message reinforced the same idea, that the Allied invasion would strike the Pas de Calais. When the Germans requested confirmation, Garbo and his handlers provided it, timed perfectly to match the movements of the Phantom Army across Kent. The Germans believed every word. Their own intelligence analysts in France and Berlin compiled reports showing the massive build-up opposite Calais. Reconnaissance photographs supported the story. Even intercepted Allied communications, carefully planted by the British, pointed to the same conclusion. By May 1944, the German High Command was convinced that the main invasion force would cross the Channel at Calais. They stationed their strongest units there, the 15th Army, including powerful panzer divisions, and waited. At the same time, other deception plans reinforced Fortitude. Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable used aircraft to drop radar-reflecting strips called chaff over the sea, simulating invasion fleets heading toward Calais and the French coast. Naval units created fake radio chatter and signals. The entire English Channel became a stage for illusion. While real troops gathered in the south, preparing for Normandy, the Germans saw only what the Allies wanted them to see: an enormous phantom army ready to strike elsewhere. The British even managed to deceive their own allies to maintain secrecy. Only a handful of high-ranking officers in the United States and Britain knew the full details. The deception had to be perfect. One leak could unravel years of preparation. The coordination between intelligence, the military, and diplomacy was unprecedented. Messages had to match. False orders had to align with fake troop movements. And even weather forecasts were manipulated to keep the illusion alive. Meanwhile, across this English countryside, the real invasion force trained in silence. Soldiers rehearsed beach landings in secret, unaware of the elaborate ruse being staged on their behalf. They didn't need to know. The fewer people who knew about Fortitude, the safer it was. The deception's success would mean fewer bullets fired at them on D-Day. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler and his generals reviewed the intelligence pouring in from occupied France. Everything pointed to Calais. To Hitler, it made perfect sense. The shortest route, the best harbor access, the most logical target. He issued orders to keep his panzer reserves near Calais, ready to counterattack when the invasion came. Even after multiple warnings from his field commanders about increased Allied activity near Normandy, he refused to believe it. The deception had worked, not just tactically, but psychologically. In the final weeks before the invasion, the tension was immense. The Allied command knew that if the Germans shifted their forces even slightly, the Normandy landings could fail. The deception had to hold until the first waves of troops were ashore. Garbo and the other double agents continued to send false reports, now describing how the supposed Calais invasion was being delayed by weather, giving the real invasion more time to unfold undisturbed. Their timing was perfect. Every lie fit neatly into the enemy's expectations. On June 6, 1944, D-Day began. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and landed on the beaches of Normandy. The battle was fierce, but the Germans were unprepared. They had expected the attack at Calais, and their strongest divisions remained there, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler refused to release them. He believed that Normandy was only a diversion, a feint to draw his forces away from the real attack. Fortitude had done its job. For days, German reinforcements stayed frozen around Calais, guarding against an imaginary threat. When they finally moved toward Normandy, it was too late. The Allies had secured a foothold in France, and the liberation of Europe had begun. The success of Operation Fortitude had saved thousands of lives and shortened the war. It was one of the most effective and audacious deceptions ever carried out in military history. But behind the triumph, few people knew how close it had come to failure, and how many layers of lies it required to succeed. Fortitude wasn't just a trick. It was a masterpiece of coordination between soldiers, spies, artists, and engineers. It proved that in modern war, information could be as powerful as any weapon. The deception continued even after D-Day, ensuring the Germans kept their troops at Calais for weeks, still waiting for Patton's Phantom Army to arrive. The real invasion had succeeded because the enemy had been blinded by their own assumptions. They believed what they wanted to believe, and the Allies gave them exactly that. In war, deception works best, not when you hide the truth, but when you let your enemy build his own lies. The morning of June 6th, 1944, changed the course of history. Across the English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen struck the beaches of Normandy. The air roared with planes, the sea thundered with gunfire, and tens of thousands of soldiers fought their way ashore. But as the Allies bled for every inch of sand, the success of the invasion still depended on one thing: deception. The Germans had to remain convinced that this was not the real invasion. They had to believe the true attack was still coming. Operation Fortitude was far from over. In fact, the most critical phase was just beginning. Even as soldiers fought in France, the deception machine in Britain kept running at full strength. Every radio operator, every double agent, every fake signal now had a new mission: to convince the Germans that Normandy was a diversion. The illusion had to continue. From his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler studied the reports flooding in from France. His generals warned that a full-scale invasion was underway. But Hitler hesitated. He believed the Normandy landings were only a feint, a trap to lure his armies away from the real target at Calais. The deception had taken root so deeply that he could not see the truth, even when it was burning in front of him. In the days that followed, chaos spread through the German command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of German forces in Western Europe, begged for permission to release the panzer divisions stationed near Calais to reinforce Normandy. But Hitler refused. He was convinced the main Allied invasion would still come at Calais, under General Patton's Phantom Army. The false reports from British double agents supported his belief. Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, continued to send carefully timed messages to his German handlers. He claimed that the Normandy attack was merely a diversion to draw attention away from the real invasion that would strike at the Pas de Calais within days. His intelligence reports were filled with fabricated details, supposed troop movements, supply convoys, and coded references to non-existent divisions preparing for the main assault. The messages were so convincing that they were marked urgent and sent directly to Hitler's headquarters. Other agents reinforced the lie. Agent Brutus, Agent Tate, and others under British control fed parallel streams of false information through radio and courier networks. Each message matched the others perfectly, creating an illusion of consistency and confirmation. The Germans, believing they had multiple independent sources, saw the deception as proof. As a result, for nearly 2 weeks after D-Day, the German 15th Army, the most powerful reserve force in Western Europe, stayed frozen near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. They held back their tanks, artillery, and elite divisions, while their comrades in Normandy were slowly being overwhelmed. By the time Hitler finally allowed the panzers to move south, the Allies had already secured the beaches and built a foothold in France. Operation Fortitude had succeeded beyond all expectation. It didn't just fool a few commanders, it fooled the entire German military intelligence network. Even after Normandy was clearly established, many German officers still believed that the real invasion was yet to come. They waited for Patton's fictional army to appear, still trusting the same false reports that had misled them for months. The deception continued throughout the summer of 1944. Fake radio traffic filled the airwaves. Imaginary divisions kept reporting new movements across Kent and Dover. Reconnaissance flights over Britain still photographed dummy installations, fake airfields, fake barracks, fake supply depots. Every detail of the lie remained in place, maintained carefully by the Allies to ensure the Germans never shifted their full strength toward Normandy. Meanwhile, in France, the Allied advance gained momentum. By July, the beaches were secure, and new divisions poured into the continent every day. The liberation of Paris was only weeks away. Yet, even as the German army retreated, their leaders clung to the belief that Calais was the true objective. It was one of the greatest military deceptions ever achieved, not through force, but through psychology. Operation Fortitude proved that in war, perception can be more powerful than reality. The Germans had all the facts they needed to see the truth, but their own logic blinded them. Calais was the obvious target, and so it became the only one they could imagine. The Allies had used that expectation against them, turning their certainty into their downfall. In the aftermath of the invasion, Allied intelligence analyzed every intercepted German communication. They discovered that Hitler's belief in the Calais invasion persisted for nearly 7 weeks after D-Day. Even as Allied troops pushed deep into France, he kept several divisions stationed near Calais, convinced that Patton's army would strike any day. The Germans didn't begin to withdraw those forces until late August, by which time France was almost completely liberated. The true brilliance of Fortitude lay not only in its execution, but in its discipline. Every message, every photograph, every rumor had been crafted with precision. There were no leaks, no contradictions, no inconsistencies to expose the lie. The operation required hundreds of people across multiple countries to maintain perfect coordination, a task as difficult as any battle fought on the ground. And yet, for decades after the war, almost no one knew about it. The story of Operation Fortitude remained classified long after D-Day had passed. The soldiers who stormed the beaches never knew how much their survival depended on deception. The men and women who built fake tanks and wrote fake orders never received public recognition. Their war was fought in the shadows, and their victory came not from bullets, but from belief. When the details were finally declassified in the 1970s, historians realized just how crucial the operation had been. Without Fortitude, the Germans might have concentrated their forces at Normandy and crushed the invasion before it gained ground. The cost in lives would have been catastrophic. Instead, the deception gave the Allies the time they needed to build momentum and liberate Europe. It was, quite literally, the difference between victory and disaster. Among the few who truly understood the operation's significance was Colonel David Strangeways, the British officer who coordinated much of the deception from within the Allied command. He later said that the success of Fortitude came from understanding not just how to lie, but how to think like the enemy. To deceive effectively, they had to see the world through German eyes, to anticipate what their opponents expected and give them exactly that. That philosophy guided every part of Fortitude. The fake army near Dover existed because the Germans already believed it would be there. Patton was chosen because the Germans respected him. Every false message worked because it confirmed what German intelligence already assumed. The Allies didn't invent new truths. They amplified existing ones. When the war finally ended, the impact of Operation Fortitude echoed far beyond the beaches of Normandy. It became a model for future military deception. Its success showed that even in an age of bombs and tanks, information could still decide battles. The lessons of Fortitude would be studied by intelligence agencies for decades to come. For the double agents who made it possible, their roles remained secret for years. Juan Pujol Garcia returned to anonymity, his work hidden by official silence. He had saved countless lives through lies, and no one could know. Only decades later did his story emerge, revealing the man who deceived Hitler and won the war without ever firing a shot. Operation Fortitude remains one of the greatest achievements of intelligence and coordination in history. It was proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is belief itself. A phantom army made of air and imagination had held back the might of Germany and changed the outcome of World War II. In the end, it was not the soldiers or the machines that decided the invasion. It was the story the enemy believed. And that story was written in silence, in secrecy, and in shadows. In the weeks following D-Day, the war in Western Europe began to shift in the Allies' favor. The beaches of Normandy, once drenched in chaos and blood, were now the entry point to an advancing front that stretched across the French countryside. Yet, while the world celebrated the bravery of soldiers, far fewer understood that the outcome had been decided in the shadows by a deception so complete that even victory itself took time to be believed. Operation Fortitude did not end with the landings at Normandy. Its purpose evolved, shaping not only the invasion's first phase, but the broader campaign to liberate Europe. The Allies understood that the Germans were not easily convinced of defeat. Hitler still believed that Normandy was only the beginning of a much larger Allied feint, and so the illusion had to continue. Throughout June and July of 1944, the network of double agents kept the lie alive. German intelligence officers in occupied France and Belgium continued to receive messages describing troop concentrations in southern England. According to these reports, General Patton's army, the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, was now fully assembled and preparing for its grand assault on the Pas de Calais. The invasion, they were told, would strike as soon as weather conditions improved. Agent Garbo, the Spaniard who had fooled the Abwehr for years, reported that fresh divisions were massing around Dover. He claimed that supplies were being loaded onto landing craft, that new airfields were operational, and that a second wave of invasion was imminent. Each of these reports was pure fabrication, constructed carefully by British intelligence to reinforce the same illusion that had bought the Allies time on D-Day. By mid-July, German reconnaissance flights over England still photographed what appeared to be an enormous invasion force. In reality, those images showed inflatable tanks, wooden planes, and carefully staged camouflage nets. The illusion was so convincing that the Luftwaffe's own analysts recommended holding Panzer divisions near Calais until the main attack arrived. The Germans' best defensive units, including the 15th Army, remained paralyzed, unable to act, while the Allies advanced through Normandy. The effectiveness of this ongoing deception came not only from the fake evidence, but from how perfectly it matched German expectations. The German High Command, known as the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, had long considered Calais the most strategic invasion point. They believed that any attack elsewhere, like Normandy, must be diversionary. Fortitude exploited that bias relentlessly. Every Allied signal, every false report, and every movement supported what the Germans already thought they knew. Even when German officers on the ground in Normandy warned that the invasion was real and that reinforcements were desperately needed, their reports were dismissed in Berlin. Hitler himself continued to issue orders based on the belief that the true invasion had yet to come. He kept panzer divisions near Calais for almost 2 months, despite his general's protests. His conviction was so strong that even after Paris was liberated in August, he still spoke of an Allied attack expected at Calais any day now. This paralysis within the German command structure was one of the key reasons the Allies were able to push inland so quickly. The deception had succeeded, not by changing the Germans' plans, but by freezing them. The very system of centralized control that Hitler had imposed on his generals made them incapable of adapting once they were deceived. Every decision had to come from the top, and the top was blind. Meanwhile, the Allied advance gathered unstoppable momentum. In late July, Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, tore through German defenses. The American and British armies swept across France in a lightning offensive that left the German front in ruins. The liberation of Paris followed in August. As the Allied forces pressed toward the German border, it became clear that the deception had done more than protect the invasion. It had fractured the enemy's ability to respond at all. Back in England, the masterminds of Fortitude watched the results unfold with quiet satisfaction. For years, they had lived in secrecy, manipulating information and people to build an illusion. Now, that illusion had become one of the most successful operations in military history. But the details of their success were still secret, even from many of their own comrades. Only a handful of intelligence officers and planners knew the full extent of what had been done. Among them was Colonel David Strangeways, the officer in charge of deception planning for the British 21st Army Group. Strangeways was meticulous, creative, and fiercely protective of his operation. He understood that to deceive effectively, every element of the story had to align. A single inconsistency could destroy months of work. He coordinated everything: fake troop movements, radio traffic, and the reports from double agents, ensuring that no detail contradicted another. The coordination extended across multiple Allied intelligence organizations. The British Security Service, MI5, managed the double agents. The Special Operations Executive handled sabotage and misinformation in occupied Europe. The American Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, provided support and analysis. The Royal Air Force and Royal Navy both created physical evidence: dummy aircraft, fake convoys, false radio chatter. The entire operation was a symphony of deceit, conducted with perfect discipline. Even after the liberation of France, Fortitude's network continued to operate. The Allies still needed to keep the Germans uncertain about where the next attack might occur. Deception operations suggested future invasions along the French coast, in the Balkans, and even in Norway. The goal was to stretch German resources thin, forcing them to defend everywhere and commit nowhere. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, was in chaos. Many of its agents had already been captured or turned by the British. Its reports to the German High Command were filled with contradictions and confusion. The same double agents who had deceived them before D-Day were now feeding new stories about Allied advances, sometimes contradicting each other on purpose to create further disarray. For Hitler, the psychological consequences of Fortitude were devastating. The invasion had shattered his confidence in his own intelligence apparatus. He no longer trusted his generals or their reports. He began issuing direct orders to move divisions based on his intuition rather than evidence. In doing so, he weakened the German army even further. Fortitude had not only deceived him, it had undermined his faith in the very system that sustained his war effort. By the autumn of 1944, the Allies had pushed the Germans back across France and into Belgium. The deception operations gradually wound down, their purpose fulfilled. But the legacy of Fortitude endured. Within the Allied command, it was recognized as a turning point, proof that intelligence and strategy could achieve what sheer force could not. It was the triumph of planning over power, of ideas over armies. Yet, for the men and women who had carried it out, recognition would not come for decades. Their achievements remained buried in classified files. The double agents returned to their ordinary lives, their names erased from public record. Even Gabo, the man who had deceived Hitler himself, vanished from history for a time. After the war, he faked his death and disappeared into anonymity, living quietly in South America for years before his story was finally revealed. When historians later examined the documents declassified in the 1970s, they discovered the full extent of the operation. The scale of coordination between intelligence agencies, the precision of the false information, and the timing of each deception made Fortitude not just a successful trick, but a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It had required imagination as much as intellect, and its consequences were as profound as any battle fought in the open. But even as they studied it, one question remained. Why had it worked so perfectly? Why had the Germans, with all their resources, failed to see through the illusion? The answer lay in the very nature of intelligence itself. Information, no matter how detailed, is interpreted through belief. The Germans did not simply accept the false evidence. They confirmed it within their own expectations. They saw what they wanted to see. Fortitude succeeded because it aligned so precisely with their fears. Every photograph of fake tanks, every intercepted radio signal, every double agent's message fit neatly into a worldview the German command already held. They were not deceived by the Allies alone. They were deceived by themselves. As the war moved into its final year, the lessons of Fortitude began to shape the future of espionage and warfare. Intelligence officers realized that deception was not about creating lies, but about building believable realities. The principles developed during Fortitude, misinformation layered with truth, timing synchronized with enemy psychology, and communication channels controlled with precision, became the foundation for modern strategic deception. Even after the guns fell silent, the influence of Fortitude could be felt in every intelligence service in the world. The Soviet Union studied it, learning from how easily Hitler had been misled. The United States incorporated its methods into the early Cold War, using similar techniques in Korea and beyond. Fortitude had shown that the human mind could be a battlefield, and that victory there could determine the outcome of wars. In the coming months, as Allied troops advanced toward Germany, the deceptions would shift again, paving the way for new operations that confused and fragmented the enemy's response. But Fortitude remained the template, the perfect execution of a lie that saved millions of lives and ended one of the darkest chapters in history. As the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, the war in Europe entered its final phase. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were advancing toward Germany. Yet, even as tanks rolled through the French countryside, the invisible war of deception was still being fought. The shadow of Operation Fortitude stretched far beyond the beaches. It lived on in the minds of men, in the confusion of German generals, the quiet brilliance of Allied planners, and the unseen courage of those who lied for freedom. Inside the walls of Allied intelligence headquarters in London, small groups of officers continued their work in near silence. Their offices were filled with maps, coded messages, and piles of intercepted German communications. Each morning, analysts compared what the Germans believed to what was actually happening on the front. Their goal was to keep the deception consistent, to make sure the illusion did not unravel too soon. Among those who had orchestrated this vast network was a man named Colonel John Bevan. As head of the London controlling section, Bevan was one of the architects of Fortitude. He worked in anonymity, coordinating with the British Chiefs of Staff and the American command. Bevan understood that a successful deception was not about hiding the truth. It was about controlling it. He shaped the flow of information so perfectly that every German question found a false but believable answer. His office managed not only Fortitude, but an entire web of deception operations across Europe. Each plan had its own name, its own lies, its own purpose. Operation Ironside hinted at an invasion of Bordeaux. Operation Vendetta suggested attacks in the Mediterranean. Together, they created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. The Germans never knew where the next blow would fall. The chaos of misinformation made every coastline seem vulnerable, every rumor dangerous. But the most remarkable achievements of Fortitude were made not in offices, but in the field, by the spies who risked their lives inside enemy territory and behind friendly lines alike. Agent Garbo, whose real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, was perhaps the most extraordinary of them all. He was not a soldier or a trained spy when the war began. He was an ordinary man from Barcelona who despised both fascism and communism. He decided on his own that he wanted to help the Allies by deceiving the Germans. He began by sending false reports to the Nazis, claiming to have a network of informants in Britain. At first, British intelligence didn't believe him, but when they saw how easily he fooled the Germans, they brought him into MI5. Under British supervision, Garbo built an imaginary network of 27 sub-agents, none of whom existed. He invented their names, their families, their personalities, and even their deaths. When one of his imaginary agents was killed in a bombing raid, he sent a heartfelt letter of condolence to the Germans, who replied with sympathy and a pension for the dead man's widow. His attention to detail was so complete that the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, never suspected the truth. They awarded Garbo the Iron Cross for his service, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. The same man later received the Member of the British Empire Medal from King George VI. He remains the only person in history to be decorated by both sides in the same war. Garbo was not alone. Agent Brutus, whose real name was Roman Czerniawski, was a Polish pilot who had been captured by the Germans early in the war. Recruited by the Abwehr to spy for them, he immediately offered his services to British intelligence after escaping to England. He became one of the most trusted double agents in the network, feeding German intelligence with precise falsehoods. His reports complemented Garbo's, reinforcing the illusion of the Phantom Army under Patton's command. Another key player was Agent Tate, a Norwegian named Wolf Schmidt. He had been captured by the British early in the war and offered a choice: imprisonment or cooperation. He chose to cooperate. His false radio transmissions helped to shape the German belief that the Allies' main forces were still waiting across the Channel. Every message he sent was reviewed by British handlers, written in the careful tone of an experienced spy reporting from the field. To his German superiors, he appeared reliable and patriotic. In truth, every signal he transmitted brought their defeat closer. These men and women were not soldiers on the battlefield, yet their courage was no less. They operated under constant pressure. A single mistake in tone or timing could expose the entire deception. They had to think like their enemies, speak their language, and anticipate their reactions. Their lies had to be perfect. The British Saint-Inky Committee, led by John Masterman, managed the entire network of double agents. They coordinated their stories, edited their reports, and ensured consistency across every communication. The system worked like an orchestra, each agent playing a part in a carefully designed symphony of misinformation. The Germans, listening from afar, believed they were hearing the voices of loyal operatives scattered across the British Isles. In truth, they were hearing the echoes of their own destruction. While the deception played out, the Germans' ability to gather accurate intelligence collapsed. The Abwehr, once a powerful intelligence organization, was in disarray. British code breakers at Bletchley Park had already broken the Enigma cipher, allowing the Allies to read German communications in real time. This gave British planners a unique advantage. They knew exactly what the Germans believed, and they used that knowledge to refine their lies. It was a closed loop of deception, self-correcting, and constantly improving. Bletchley Park's success and Operation Fortitude's precision formed a partnership that changed the course of war. The codebreakers could see the immediate effects of every deception. When a false report was sent, the intercepted German messages would reveal how it had been received. If a lie was believed, it would be reinforced. If it was questioned, it would be adjusted. This feedback made Fortitude almost impossible to counter. The Allies were not guessing. They were reacting in real time to the enemy's thoughts. By late 1944, this mastery of information had become one of the Allies' greatest strengths. The battlefield was not just in the fields of France. It was in the minds of men reading reports in Berlin. Every intercepted message, every rumor whispered among German officers, carried the fingerprints of Fortitude. The enemy had become trapped in a mirror maze of their own intelligence. Meanwhile, within the German High Command, paranoia grew. Hitler's inner circle began to suspect that their spies had been compromised. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Trust within the Abwehr collapsed completely. Rival intelligence agencies, including the SS's Sicherheitsdienst, began accusing each other of failure and treason. The once feared German intelligence machine disintegrated into suspicion and chaos. For the Allies, this disarray was invaluable. With the enemy's intelligence blinded, their operational freedom increased dramatically. They could move troops, prepare new offensives, and even shift entire divisions without detection. Fortitude had not only protected D-Day, it had reshaped the intelligence war for the rest of the conflict. As winter approached and Allied armies reached the German border, the deception networks were gradually dismantled. Many of the double agents were retired, their identities protected by secrecy. Some faded into obscurity. Others lived with the burden of knowing they had built their legacy on lies. They had deceived the enemy, but deception changes those who practice it. Some agents later described feelings of emptiness, of having lived too long behind a mask. For others, it was pride, the knowledge that their words had saved thousands of lives. The true magnitude of their achievements was known only to a few senior officers. The reports filed after the war revealed that the Germans had maintained heavy forces in the Pas de Calais for nearly 2 months after D-Day. Those divisions never fired a shot in defense of Normandy. Their inaction allowed the Allies to expand their foothold, advance inland, and eventually encircle the German army in France. Without fortitude, the liberation of Europe would have taken far longer, and the human cost would have been far greater. It is said that wars are won by those who fight. But in this case, victory was also won by those who pretended to fight. The soldiers of fortitude never carried rifles or stormed beaches. They wielded pens, telegraphs, and typewriters. They worked in smoke-filled rooms, writing lies that shaped history. After the war, when their stories finally emerged, the world was astonished. Historians and journalists began to piece together the fragments, the fake tanks, the radio chatter, the phantom divisions, and the double agents who had fooled an empire. It seemed almost impossible that such a vast deception could remain secret for so long. But that secrecy had been its greatest weapon. For decades, fortitude was known only to those who lived it. And even among them, few ever understood how all the parts fit together. They were simply doing their jobs, unaware that they were part of a masterpiece of strategy and imagination. By the time autumn faded into winter in 1944, the truth had finally caught up to the lie. The Germans had lost France. Paris was free. Allied forces had crossed the Seine, pushing towards the Rhine. But even then, in the chaos of retreat, remnants of the deception still lingered in the German command. Reports continued to arrive, filled with false sightings of Allied divisions in southern England, imaginary supply depots in Kent, and coded references to a second invasion. Even as their empire crumbled, they waited for a strike at Calais that would never come. It was only in late September, nearly 4 months after D-Day, that the German High Command finally admitted the truth. There would be no second invasion. They had been deceived from the start. The illusion of the first U.S. Army Group, Patton's Phantom Command, had held them hostage for the entire summer. Thousands of German soldiers had been left idle, guarding empty beaches, while real battles were fought and lost hundreds of miles away. The revelation struck deep at the heart of Hitler's regime. His once feared intelligence network, the Abwehr, was now in ruins. Distrust spread through every level of the Nazi hierarchy. The Führer himself grew increasingly isolated, consumed by paranoia. He lashed out at his generals, accusing them of incompetence and betrayal. In his bunker conferences, he returned again and again to the Allied invasion, unable to comprehend how his armies had been so thoroughly deceived. He ordered investigations, demanded explanations, and even considered purges among his intelligence staff. But there was no one left to blame. The enemy had not defeated him with armies. They had defeated him with imagination. While Germany struggled to understand what had happened, the Allies quietly dismantled the machinery of deception that had made it possible. The dummy installations were taken down. The inflatable tanks were deflated and packed away. The wooden aircraft and landing craft were scrapped or recycled. The fake radio stations fell silent. The great illusion that had shaped the course of the war simply vanished, leaving behind no trace of its existence. But in offices across London and Washington, a new understanding began to take shape. Fortitude had proven something profound, that in modern warfare, controlling information was as important as controlling territory. Victory did not belong only to those who fought on the battlefield, but also to those who mastered the flow of truth and lies. In the age of total war, deception had become a weapon as real as any bomb or bullet. The lessons of Operation Fortitude were quickly absorbed into post-war intelligence doctrine. The British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and the newly formed American Central Intelligence Agency studied every detail of the operation. They analyzed how the deception had been planned, how information had been managed, and how the enemy's psychology had been exploited. Fortitude became the blueprint for future operations, not just in warfare, but in diplomacy, espionage, and propaganda. In the early years of the Cold War, both East and West built their strategies on its principles. The Soviet Union studied it carefully, learning how easily a powerful nation could be misled when fed the right mixture of truth and illusion. The United States used similar techniques in Korea, Cuba, and beyond. Every major intelligence campaign that followed carried echoes of Fortitude, the art of creating a believable lie. But long before those new wars began, the people who had created Fortitude had already moved on. For them, the deception had been a duty, not a profession. Many returned to ordinary lives, their contributions unknown, their heroism classified. The soldiers who had risked their lives in Normandy never knew how much they owed to the men and women who fought with words and shadows. Even within the intelligence community, few understood how many lives had been saved by a handful of lies told at exactly the right time. Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Carbo, disappeared after the war. The British faked his death to protect him, helping him start a new life in South America. For nearly 40 years, the man who had deceived Hitler lived in silence, running a small business in Venezuela. Only in the 1980s did journalists uncover his story and bring him back into the light. When he returned to Britain in 1984, he was welcomed quietly by surviving members of the intelligence community. There were no parades, no headlines, only respect. He had changed the course of history, and almost no one knew his name. Other members of the deception network found similar fates. Some remained in government service, helping to shape the intelligence world that emerged after the war. Others retired in obscurity, their achievements buried in classified archives. It would take decades for the full story of Operation Fortitude to reach the public. When it finally did, it seemed almost unbelievable, a story too strange to be real. But every detail was true. The fake army had existed, the double agents had been real, and Hitler had been fooled completely. In the years after the war, historians struggled to measure the true impact of Fortitude. How many lives had been saved? How much faster had the war ended because of it? There was no precise answer, but the evidence was clear. Without Fortitude, the Germans would have concentrated their defenses at Normandy, turning D-Day into a bloodbath. The invasion might have failed. The liberation of Europe could have been delayed for years. The Soviet Union might have advanced further into the continent, reshaping post-war Europe entirely. The world we know today might have been unrecognizable. All of that changed because of a lie. A lie built from courage, intellect, and discipline. A lie told not for power, but for freedom. Operation Fortitude proved that truth and deception are not opposites. They are tools. In the hands of good men, a lie can save a world. In the hands of tyrants, truth itself can be twisted into a weapon. The architects of Fortitude understood this balance. They walked a line between morality and necessity, between what was right and what was required. And they did it knowing that their work would never be celebrated, their names never spoken, their victories never seen. The influence of Fortitude extended even into the realm of technology. The systems developed for fake radio transmissions evolved into the methods used in electronic warfare. Psychological operations became a recognized field of study. What began as an improvisation in 1944 became a permanent part of military science. The lessons learned on the beaches of Normandy and the fields of Kent became part of the invisible architecture of every modern conflict. Yet beyond the technical triumphs, Fortitude remains a human story, a story of people who used creativity as a weapon, the artists who painted fake shadows on canvas tanks, the engineers who built decoy landing craft from wood and canvas, the actors who played soldiers in non-existent divisions, the women who typed fake orders and forged documents in dimly lit offices. Each of them played a role in a deception so vast that it fooled an empire. Their creativity became their courage, their imagination, their weapon. In the end, Fortitude was not just a military operation. It was a reflection of the human spirit. It showed that victory does not belong only to the strongest, but to those who can think beyond the limits of reality. It proved that wars are fought not only on battlefields, but also in minds. And it reminded the world that even in the darkest moments, the greatest strength lies in unity, ingenuity, and belief. Years after the war, General Dwight D. Eisenhower reflected on D-Day and the deception that made it possible. He said simply, "If we did not have the enemy fooled, I would not have had the courage to go." That single sentence captured everything Fortitude had accomplished. It gave the Allied commander confidence to launch the greatest invasion in history. It gave soldiers the chance to survive. It gave the world a chance to win. As the decades passed, the story of Operation Fortitude faded into history books and documentaries. But its influence remains alive in every act of strategy, in every covert operation, in every calculated risk taken by those who understand that wars are not just fought with weapons, but with ideas. The deception that saved D-Day continues to echo across time, a reminder of what can be achieved when intelligence, creativity, and courage come together. In the end, Operation Fortitude was not just a secret plan. It was the triumph of imagination over destruction. It was the victory of minds over machines. It was proof that the right idea, in the right hands, can change the course of history. This was the unknown zone, where history's hidden stories come to light. Operation Fortitude wasn't just a secret mission. It was a masterpiece of deception, a web of lies that saved millions of lives and changed the course of the Second World War. No tanks, no bullets, no armies, only imagination, precision, and courage. It showed the world that truth alone doesn't win wars. Understanding the mind of your enemy does. From the shadow of Normandy to the silence of intelligence offices, ordinary people built an illusion so powerful it fooled an empire. It proved that victory is not always written by those who fight, but sometimes by those who think. The story of Fortitude is more than history. It's a reminder of what humans can achieve when creativity meets conviction, when courage isn't measured in battles won, but in lies told to save the world. Thank you for watching The Unknown Zone, where the truth hides in plain sight